Good evening and welcome to Planet Action this Thursday, the 17th of November 2022. My name is Purity Museo. The COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, expected to end tomorrow, was expected to make clear for Africa especially and developing countries around the world that it's not longer enough to mitigate the climate crisis. There is need to adapt and build resilience in order to survive and thrive. So what are some of the key things countries need to do to tackle the climate problem? Today we talk about climate adaptation or solutions, but first, before that conversation, billionaire philanthropist Bill Gates, who is currently in the country, has pledged to continue supporting Kenya in various areas such as healthcare and agriculture. Bill Gates arrived in the country on Tuesday for a series of engagements and kicked off his visit in Makueni County.
All the opportunity to, innovate in agriculture, innovate in energy, innovate in health. It's to help educate the young people, make sure they're healthy. And I think we'll be very impressed with what they do. Our second biggest program after health, although health is gigantic. I mean, HIV alone, malaria alone, polio alone. These are, those programs are over 400 million a year each. In the area of agriculture, fortunately, the good news is that there's a lot of innovation. That is, you can make much better seeds. A good example is a group we funded to do water efficient maize, WEMA, water efficient maize for Africa. And that was a very successful project where, under drought conditions, maize productivity is about 30% higher. And so that's extremely beneficial for farmers to have that extra productivity. We also can bring into seeds a lot of disease resistance. You've seen leaf necrosis, fall armyworm, a number of diseases of maize, have been very troubling for farmers. And there's a variety of ways to make seeds, all of which we fund to get rid of those diseases. Maize productivity in Kenya is actually not very high. Obviously, if you look at Western farming, you've got a lot of irrigation, you've got a lot of fertilizer, but the yields would be over 4 times as great.
And African leaders have termed the ongoing summit on climate change, COP27 in Egypt, a failure, saying the demands by poor and developing countries for climate financing to help them deal and cope with the effects of climate change seemed to have fallen on deaf ears. According to Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, developed countries or nations should provide financial resources to help developing parties with respect to mitigation and adaptation. Suleiman Yeri spoke to a section of them, and here are some of the reactions.
Young people, once again, have been disadvantaged. Moving ahead to COP28, our future looks uncertain, and we are not sure of what our next step would look like. And we want to call on leaders, knowing that COP27 is already a disappointment for young people, including women and girls. We would encourage the African group of negotiators to continue to look at our various recommendations from young people, policy statements, to ensure that young people are included in especially locally led adaptation project that we have been calling for and been pushing for. For now, young people are not proud of the outcome so far at the negotiation room.
We cannot continue having different COPs coming up with programs, coming up with work plans, but without concrete finance on the ground. Everyone is deciding or choosing to go for voluntary contributions. No, we needed committed finance. We needed committed finance to ensure that whatever we are agreeing on here can be implemented on the ground back home.
We leave less reassured of the goodwill of global leaders, especially those in high polluting industrialized countries, to make the bold decisions needed to respond to the scale and urgency of the climate crisis.
But we have no answer to our communities suffering in northern Kenya, to those communities that lost livestock, to those communities that are dying, to that particular woman, to the children of that particular woman who died looking for, water for the children, leaving behind 7 children. Or are we going to go and tell that kid or those particular children? We won't go empty-handed, and I think the future is very, very, very.
Now, COP27 Climate Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt has been billed as a watershed moment for climate change. Stakeholders say that the mitigation program is yet to reach the desired outcome. The ambitious outcomes on finance are also yet to materialize. So what are some of the key things countries need to do to tackle the problem? In studio tonight is Dr. Shem Kuya, a senior lecturer and researcher at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Technology and Agriculture. J.K. Watt, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
All right, and let's begin with the recap on COP27. It's coming to an end tomorrow, probably as a researcher and from a developing world. You remember, developing countries are facing the crisis. What were your expectations? And number 2, they already said that the mitigation program has not been met, and the funding also, that agenda has not materialized. Again, I'll be asking you, what does this mean in addressing the crisis that we are facing?
Thank you, Purity. My expectation of the COP27 was that the leaders of the world would enhance mitigation, measures, and then also so that they would raise the ambition for us to be able to keep the temperatures below 1.5, below 2 increase. And then also the other expectation was that the adaptation part of climate change efforts would also be enhanced.
Yes.
So 2 things: one, to enhance adaptation, and the second one would be
on the mitigation,
to increase ambition.
Yes.
So that the ambitions are increased and the adaptation is enhanced. The reason is that over time, adaptation has not been given the attention it deserves.
Yes.
But also people still continue to feel the impact of climate change, especially in developing countries.
Yes, and before we talk about the adaptation, because that's now the only option that especially developing world has, they have said, or they pushed the loss and damage fund agenda to 2024. That was the main agenda that African nations, let me say developing world, that are facing this crisis had. And now the mitigation program, again, they say has not materialized. What does all this mean to addressing the climate crisis?
I think what it means is that particularly on adaptation scenario, is that the situation will continue as is, because adaptation requires financing and it's costly. So it means that in the context of floods, people will continue to experience those floods because we don't have capacity to be able to build resilient infrastructures or mechanisms to be able to help our people adapt to climate change. It also means that we look into ourselves for locally available approaches or region-specific approaches that we can be able to use to ensure that we are able to cope with the existing impacts of climate change.
Absolutely, and we're already facing that. We've experienced the worst drought. We also, it's raining in some also African countries. We saw Nigeria, how the flooding was. So let's now come back to climate adaptation. Like you said, it's now the only option we have. And when we talk about climate adaptation, maybe in layman's language, what exactly are we talking about?
So when we talk about climate adaptation, one, it's one of the 2 responses to the climate crisis. Adaptation and mitigation, complementary responses. Adaptation says adjust, mitigation says stop. Mitigation calls on stopping emission of greenhouse gases and enhancing storage of carbon, one of the culprits of greenhouse gases. But then now adaptation has to do with actions that we engage to manage the effects of climate change. Okay, so we're looking at a situation where we have to manage the negative effects of climate change and at the same time look at opportunities that are created by the climate crisis. So that's what adaptation has to do.
Yeah.
And the main aim is to be able to help people and places here I mean ecosystems, environment, to help people and places to be able to adjust to the current reality of climate change, but also to future anticipated. And this is important because of two reasons. One, it's because climate change is already here with us,
Right.
meaning we have to do something. We have to do something at minimum to survive.
Yes.
But then we have to do more if we want to thrive. And so that is one of the reasons why we must do something to adapt to climate change.
Yes. And
But then the other reason will be the gases that we release in the air will not dissolve very soon. They stay longer, meaning that generations to come are likely to face the impacts of climate change. So we have to build adaptation we have to be able to adapt to climate change and prepare for generations to come.
And conversation about adaptation, the developing world says that this is what we should be having, because when you look at emission of these greenhouse gases, it's the developed world that are the greatest emitters. Now let's talk about adaptation, and it's the need to adjust. You've said, why are we not doing that? What are some of the hindrances to climate adaptation?
There are so many. I'll look at one as lack of resources, and that's why failure to have substantial financial commitment is an issue with the COP22. So lack of resources here includes one, staff capable with the capacity, but also it needs funding. That's a really limitation. But then the other limitations have to do with the lack of scientific knowledge and data. And this one is also in a range of its own. It ranges from completely absence of certain data to having data available but then you cannot access, to also not knowing what to do with the available data. So you have information but then you don't understand. So those are limitations. But then there are other categories of limitations that deal with beliefs. Okay, you have beliefs, you have beliefs and motivations. Those also they really affect communities' ability to adapt. I'm looking at a scenario where someone doesn't have money, someone has information that there will be floods, but it doesn't have money to move to an alternative place. But even when an opportunity is presented, the culture and the belief do not allow this person to move. Exactly. And of course, there are these issues of governance and institutional issues. For example, regulations, they are also a hindrance to adaptation. So there's a whole chain of things. They are complex and they interact to bring about this hindrance.
Absolutely. And talking about lack of resources, lack of finances, of course, that is not a conversation this year during COP27 because that agenda has been pushed. So what should we do as countries that do not have enough finances to just ensure that we adopt some of these adaptation techniques as much as we can afford? Can we still do something even without the help or the financing? Yeah.
Yes, we can do something. One of the things we need to know is that climate change occurs globally but affects very locally, so we need local solutions. It's possible. One of the low-hanging fruit will be ecosystem-based adaptation, using our environment, using our ecosystem, using nature to provide some of these solutions. And one of the solutions that we have seen, which I would call like an action, an adaptation action, would be the simple act of growing trees. Okay, popularly people talk about agroforestry. We're talking about growing trees rather than planting trees in ceremonial settings, and this has a phenomenal effect. We have seen this with the fruit trees for climate change adaptation and mitigation. These fruits are able to provide food in the lean period because the trees may not really be affected by variable rainfall, especially when they are mature. So they are able, but they are also able to diversify diets, because when you look at nutritional insecurity, and food insecurity. One aspect is lack of food, but the other aspect is lack of healthy foods. So when you have these ecosystem services, these nature benefits that we derive from nature, and for example trees which are able to provide fruits during lean periods when crops are not in harvest or when farmers have exhausted their cereal crop, then that is an important measure. There are also others that you can use, for example, to make our agriculture resilient to climate change.
And you know, that brings me to the fact that the country, some parts of the country are experiencing rains, and remember, we've also are coming from a period of drought. So let's talk about the rains. Let's talk about the water harvesting systems, because we see flooding happening, and then after a few months, again drought, and people are talking about shortage of water. What can we do?
So one of the things that we can do is to enhance water harvesting. At farm level, we can think about water ponds. We can think about farm ponds. But then we can also think about small tanks that can be able to collect water from roofs. But this one also requires planning. For example, our constructions, are we able to include, and this is where adaptation comes. It doesn't stand on its own. It builds on existing mechanisms. And so if we're talking about farming, we're looking at a way of harvesting, whether it is stormwater or roof water that can be able to help provide water for crop production, water for livestock, but also water for domestic use. We've seen a situation where we use subsurface water retention technology, where we install a tailor-made membrane into the soil, and it's able to help the soil produce even in very dry areas, including sandy soils. So water harvesting will be very critical, but then it requires finances. It requires that our government put mechanisms, one, to educate the people about the benefit, but two, to move and bring this infrastructure to be made.
And because food security is one of the consequences of climate change, we've seen the government distributing food to counties that have been affected. We already know, and we have mapped out the countries that are arid and semi-arid counties, so the ones that are prone to drought. So what should, do I say government, or what should our people do to ensure, like you are mentioning about the farming systems resilience, to ensure that we do not have that cycle of donations and sending donations, and we are really resilient to this fact?
Yes, so one is to increase productivity, because without having our people with the food, what causes them to go and destroy environment? They're not necessarily destroying environment to buy a car, but then to have food. So one is to build resilient production systems. I've mentioned one to be the use of agroforestry, but then also we have other mechanisms that you can use to build resilient production systems. I will think about diversifying production, for example, using crops that take longer. I'm thinking about using crop rotation or intercropping, so that you have security for the crop. If one crop fails, then the farmer is able to harvest another. One would be to secure production. But then also we have to look at other crops that are likely to grow in situations where there is drought-tolerant crops.
And maybe from research, you can list a few of them?
I will think about cassava. Cassava is one of the crops that you can store in situ. I will think about sweet potatoes. You can store in situ. I will think about sorghum, which is relatively drought tolerant. I will think about cowpea, which is really drought tolerant. So, but then also the utilization of these crops would have to come with the change of beliefs and motivations.
Beliefs and motivations. Are people aware? Who is responsible for making awareness? Because it rains, and people, when it's drought season, people will look up to the government. What again can I do at a personal level to ensure that I am not going to look up to the next neighbor when I do not have food, when there's drought? How do we prepare ourselves as families that we have enough food whether it rains or not? I know you've talked about the drought resistant crops, but again, what is the level of awareness among communities?
The level of awareness mainly is based on experience. And the more people are exposed to certain experiences, the more they are likely to remain there. And so there is need for us to step up awareness. Technology has provided some benefits, especially where there is the use of mobile phones in sending information. For example, just alerting farmers that it will rain during this period. Yeah. But then also there is now the need for public-private partnership. The need to bring other stakeholders that can help scale up technologies that are able to help us adapt. Right. I'm thinking about a situation where we have information shared with farmers, but then we are able also to bring these farmers together for participatory discussions to look at their needs and to co-create their solutions, so that the solutions they create can work in the environment they exist.
All right, Dr. Shem, thank you so much for your time. We have to wrap it up now. And thank you so much for watching Climate Action this night. My name is Purity Musea. The conversation continues tomorrow because we are on every Monday to Friday. Enjoy the rest of your viewing and God bless.